The cameras love this room. Crystal chandeliers glow against pale walls. Strings play something soft and expensive. A bride in white steps carefully down a red-carpeted, heart-shaped staircase, her dress spilling over the stone like foam on the Atlantic. Guests turn their phones toward her, trying to capture just a little bit of this perfection. They don't know the staircase has a nickname, the Sweetheart Staircase. They just know it looks like a scene from a movie, because in a way, it is. Rosecliff, this marble summer cottage on the cliffs of Newport, Rhode Island, has been a film set for decades. Its grand ballroom, the largest private ballroom in Newport at 40 by 80 feet, has doubled for Gatsby's parties, high society weddings, and glittering fictional lives. Today, you can buy a ticket, walk in the front door, and pose on that same staircase for your own photos. Or you can rent the entire mansion for a wedding, a gala, or a fundraiser, and pretend this place has always been about romance and happy endings. But look a little closer, and this house starts to feel different. The tours talk about architecture, about famous parties, about movies shot under painted ceilings. They don't always tell you whose money paid for this fantasy. They don't dwell on the dangerous Western mines, the broken marriage, the contested will, or the woman who treated society like a full-time job, and died more or less alone in the very town she worked so hard to conquer. This is the other side of Rosecliff, a story about how far people will go to buy their way into the right rooms, and how much that actually costs. In this video, we're going to strip away the soft lighting and the wedding hashtags. We'll follow Theresa Tessie, fair Oelrichs, from rough mining camps in Nevada to the marble halls of Newport. We'll see how silver pulled from the Comstock Lode was turned into French gardens, sweetheart staircases, and parties designed to intimidate as much as impress. And we'll look at the people who kept all of this running, from miners deep underground to servants who slipped silently through hidden doors just out of sight. If you like deep dives into mansions, fortunes, and the real price of high society, go ahead and subscribe to the channel now. It helps us tell more stories like this, where the beauty is real, but so is the bill. Because the truth is, Rosecliff is more than a pretty backdrop. It's a ledger carved in stone, one column for glamour, another for scandal, and somewhere in invisible ink, the line that reads, "Human cost." Tonight we're going to read that ledger. Long before Rosecliff's marble shone in the Newport sun, its story began in dust, darkness, and noise. In the 1860s and 1870s, high in the mountains of Nevada, men chased veins of silver through rock in one of the most famous strikes in American history, the Comstock Lode. Shafts ran thousands of feet deep. Temperatures underground could reach over 100 degrees. Mines flooded, timbers collapsed, and toxic dust filled the air. But the money was unbelievable. From a section called the Big Bonanza, one partnership pulled out what would amount to hundreds of millions of dollars in today's money. One of the men at the top of that partnership was James Graham Fair, an Irish immigrant who had worked his way up from miner to superintendent to part owner. Success gave him a new title, one of the Bonanza Kings. Newspapers loved the story. Poor Irishman becomes mining millionaire, but the reality behind the nickname was rougher. The Comstock was famous for deadly accidents, fires, and chronic health problems for the men who went underground every day. They took the risks. Men like Fair took the profits. Fair's personal life was almost as chaotic as the mines. He married a young woman named Theresa Rooney, and they had several children, including a daughter also named Theresa, the girl who would grow up to be Tessie Fair. But as Fair's wealth grew, so did the scandals. There were rumors of heavy drinking, affairs, and cruel treatment. Eventually, his wife divorced him, a rare and public move in that era. She took the children and moved away. Fair stayed with his fortune. Tessie grew up between two worlds, the rough West and the polished East. She spent parts of her childhood in San Francisco as her father invested in railroads, real estate, and other ventures. She saw the way money could change how people treated you. She also saw how unstable that money could feel when it depended on one man's will. When Fair died in 1894, the newspapers focused on the numbers. His estate was reported in the tens of millions of dollars, a huge sum at the time. After legal wrangling and settlements, Tessie and her sister Virginia each inherited several $1 million, which would equal well over $100 million apiece today. But those numbers hide the real story. That fortune came from a place where miners worked 12-hour shifts in heat and darkness, breathing dust laced with arsenic and mercury. In some years, dozens died in explosions and cave-ins. Rivers and soil downstream from the mines were contaminated with tailings and chemicals used for processing ore. The Comstock made a handful of men fabulously rich, but it left scars on the land and on the bodies of the workers whose names never made it into society pages. By the time Tessie was a young woman, the money was already starting to change shape. Silver and gold were being turned into stocks, townhouses, yachts, and an even more valuable asset: social acceptance. Old money families on the East Coast often sneered at new money, especially if it came from the rough edges of industry, mining, railroads, oil. But they also loved a big check. For Tessie, this was the opportunity. She wasn't born into the tidy world of New York and Newport drawing rooms. She came from blasting powder and mining camps. But she now held a key in her hands, a fortune large enough to force the gates of the most exclusive society in America. And she wasn't planning to knock politely. She was planning to kick those doors open, then decide who else got to come in. The next stop on that journey would not be a mine or a San Francisco mansion. It would be a carefully chosen marriage and a new stage, the summer playground of America's richest families, Newport, Rhode Island. When Theresa Tessie Fair first arrived in Newport, she was not the woman of Rosecliff. She was the rich daughter of a Western mining king, testing the waters of a world that did not quite know what to do with her. Newport, Rhode Island, in the late 1800s, was more than a seaside town. It was a stage. Here, the richest families in America built their summer cottages, marble palaces with ocean views, where rules mattered just as much as money. Old names like Astor and Vanderbilt set the tone. If you were in, you were invited to their balls. If you were out, all the money in the world couldn't buy you a place at their dinner table. Tessie had the money. What she wanted now was the invitation. The story goes that she met Herman Oelrichs at the Newport Casino, the social center of town, while watching tennis. Herman was no miner. He was a well-established shipping magnate, the American agent for the Norddeutscher Lloyd steamship line, with deep connections in New York and Newport society. In him, Tessie saw more than a husband. She saw a bridge from rough Western wealth to the polished world she craved. They married in 1890 in a lavish San Francisco wedding. Tessie's father, James Graham Fair, reportedly gave her $1 million as a gift, a staggering fortune at the time. But he was not invited to the ceremony. The message was clear. Tessie was turning her back on the chaotic, scandal-filled world of her parents' marriage and stepping into something new. After the wedding, Tessie moved east for good. She and Herman took up residence in an impressive New York house at 5th Avenue and 57th Street, and she began the real work, carving out her place in the upper layers of New York and Newport society. For some people, social life is just parties. For Tessie, it was a job. Friends and relatives later described her as being strongly addicted to society as a business. Invitations, calling cards, guest lists. These were not casual details. They were tools. Tessie studied who sat where, who danced with whom, who was rising, and who was slipping. She hosted dinners, attended charity events, and placed herself wherever power gathered, slowly turning herself from outsider heiress into a central figure in the social scene. But money and effort alone might not have been enough. Tessie needed a bigger move, something that would tie her family directly to the old guard. That opportunity came through her younger sister, Virginia, known as Birdie. In 1899, Tessie helped engineer one of the most talked-about marriages of the decade. Birdie Fair to William Kissam Vanderbilt II, son of Alva and William K. Vanderbilt, and heir to one of the most powerful fortunes in America. It was a masterstroke. The Fair sisters, daughters of Slippery Jim from the Comstock Lode, were now tied by marriage to the Vanderbilts themselves. Society pages ate it up. From that point on, Tessie was no longer just a rich outsider. She was family. Still, there was always a tension. To the old families, Western mining money would never be as clean as inherited land and long family trees. Tessie knew this, so she didn't simply want to be accepted. She wanted to dominate. After the retirement of the famous Mrs. Astor, the unofficial queen of New York society, a new power structure formed, a triumvirate of hostesses who effectively ran the social calendar. Tessie was one of them, alongside Alva Belmont and Mamie Fish. Within that trio, Tessie earned a specific reputation. Alva Belmont was the builder, throwing huge theatrical events. Mamie Fish was the shocking one, known for wild, almost absurd parties. Tessie was the enforcer, the martinet, the drill sergeant of society. She watched the rules. She decided who was in or out. A snub from Tessie could echo across an entire season. But power came with pressure. To keep her place, Tessie had to prove that she belonged at the very top of this fragile hierarchy, year after year. That meant more than just dinners in New York. It meant having a physical symbol of her status, a place to entertain that could stand next to the great houses of Newport and not flinch. Other women had the Breakers, Marble House, and other grand cottages. Tessie wanted something that would not just match them, but in some ways surpass them. A house built purely for entertaining, designed from the ground up to help her control the social game. That house would be Rosecliff. Before it was a landmark or a movie location, Rosecliff was an answer to a question that haunted Tessie's entire life. Could money, dangerous, Western, new money, truly buy a permanent seat at the highest table? She was about to spend millions to find out. On paper, Rosecliff was a summer cottage. In reality, Tessie Fair was about to build a stage set for power. By the late 1890s, Tessie and her husband, Herman Oelrichs, had already bought their way into Newport's best address, Bellevue Avenue, the strip where America's richest families planted their oceanfront palaces. On their chosen site stood an older house, once owned by historian and diplomat George Bancroft, with famous rose gardens that gave the estate its name. That house was not enough for what Tessie had in mind. It came down. In its place, she wanted something new, something unmistakably hers. To get it, she went to the hottest architect in America's high society, Stanford White, partner in the firm McKim, Mead & White. White was the man you called when you wanted a house that didn't just look rich, but felt like a European fantasy dropped onto American soil. He had already designed mansions for Astors and Vanderbilts, grand public buildings, and even the Arch at Washington Square. He understood what clients like Tessie wanted: drama, spectacle, and a sense that they were living inside a painting. For Rosecliff, White went straight to France for inspiration. He modeled the house on the Grand Trianon at Versailles, the elegant retreat used by French kings to escape the formality of the main palace. That choice sent a very clear message. Tessie wasn't just rich. She saw herself as the hostess of a royal-style retreat on the edge of the Atlantic. Construction began around 1899 and finished in 1902. The reported cost was about $2.5 million, roughly the equivalent of tens of millions today, depending on how you calculate it. For a house used only in the summer season, that number is hard to even process. But again, Rosecliff was never meant to be a simple house. It was a tool. From the outside, Rosecliff looks almost calm. A white, U-shaped building facing the ocean, low and wide instead of tall and looming. It appears to have just two main stories, but in reality it holds 4 levels: reception rooms on the ground floor, bedrooms above, service areas in the basement, and servants' quarters tucked into the top floor. All the messy parts of running a mini hotel for the rich are hidden behind that smooth marble skin. Step through the front doors, and the purpose of this house becomes impossible to miss. You don't enter into a cozy foyer. You walk directly into a sequence of formal rooms designed to move guests step by step toward the true heart of the house, the ballroom. Along the way, there are salons and sitting rooms dressed to impress. High ceilings, tall windows, decorative plaster, expensive materials everywhere. White believed that every surface was a chance to decorate and to sell a mood, and Rosecliff shows that thinking in action. Then you reach it. The ballroom. Measuring about 40 by 80 feet, it's the largest private ballroom in Newport. A single giant room with mirrors, tall doors opening to terraces, and a painted ceiling that seems to float overhead. When you fill it with music, candles, and hundreds of people in formal dress, it stops feeling like a room and starts feeling like its own world. This is where Tessie planned to win the social game. Not over quiet dinners, but with overwhelming spectacle. Just off this perfect stage is one of Rosecliff's most famous features, the heart-shaped or sweetheart staircase. 2 curving flights sweep down to a central landing like 2 arms meeting in an embrace. It's a photographer's dream. It was designed, very consciously, for entrances. Brides today, debutantes back then. Important guests making their way down while an entire room watched. The stairs don't just move people between floors. They frame them, turning them into living decorations. What you don't see in most photos, and what most guests didn't think about, is the machinery behind that beauty. Like other great Newport houses, Rosecliff was built with a whole parallel world for servants. Basement kitchens, pantries, laundry rooms, boiler rooms, and networks of corridors and back staircases that let staff move quickly and invisibly. Food could be prepared, plates washed, coal hauled, and beds changed while the main rooms stayed spotless and quiet. At full tilt, a house like this might employ dozens of staff in season: butlers, maids, cooks, footmen, laundresses, gardeners, coachmen or chauffeurs, plus temporary workers for big events. Stanford White was very good at designing for that hidden labor. At other houses, he used double corridors and clever layouts so that servants and guests had separate paths and rarely collided. Rosecliff reflects the same philosophy. The show is for the guests. The work happens out of sight. That split, beauty up front, effort out back, fits perfectly with Tessie's approach to life. She wanted her guests to see ease, elegance, and control. They weren't supposed to see how much planning, money, and pressure went into every detail. The entire house is a physical expression of that idea. Marble, mirrors, and ocean views hide the fact that this place only works when a small army of people are doing hard, repetitive work for long hours. Even the location plays into the illusion. Standing on the terrace, you look out over manicured lawns that run to the cliff edge. Beyond that is the Atlantic, stretching empty to the horizon. There are no mines in sight, no smokestacks, no factories. The land itself seems to say, "This life is pure. This money is clean." Of course, that's not true, but the design encourages you not to ask questions. By 1902, when Rosecliff was finally complete, Tessie had exactly what she wanted: a French-style palace on America's East Coast, custom-built for entertaining. Newspapers would describe her as one of Newport's great hostesses, and the house as one of its grandest stages. But a stage is nothing without a performance. Now that Tessie had her Versailles by the sea, she was ready to use it, to throw the kinds of parties that would cement her power, punish her enemies, and keep her name at the top of every guest list. The cost of building Rosecliff in dollars was enormous. The cost of living up to it was about to be even higher. Once Rosecliff was finished, Tessie finally had her stage. Now she had to keep the show going. A Newport season was only a few weeks long, but it ruled the entire year. For Tessie, life revolved around those summer months when the richest people in America migrated to the Rhode Island coast to see and be seen. Rosecliff wasn't just a house waiting for guests. It was a machine that had to be wound up months in advance. It began with lists, guest lists for dinners, for dances, for card parties, for teas, lists of who was in town, who was in favor, who had offended whom the year before, and needed to be punished with a pointed lack of invitation. Tessie tracked it all. To outsiders, this might sound petty. To the people who depended on these social connections for marriages, business deals, and political support, it was deadly serious. One missed name could feel like a public slap in the face. Then came the planning. Florists, musicians, caterers, dressmakers, jewelers, carriage drivers, and later chauffeurs. Everyone had to be scheduled just right. A major Rosecliff event meant deliveries at all hours, crates coming in through service entrances, extra maids brought on to help, kitchen staff pushing themselves to the point of collapse in the heat of a coal-fired range. Inside the main rooms, things had to look effortless. Behind the scenes, it was anything but. Tessie's parties weren't just social gatherings. They were weapons. One of the most famous was her bal blanc, the white ball. Guests were asked to wear white or silver. The decorations, from flowers to table linens, followed the same strict palette. Under electric lights and candle glow, the entire ballroom would have seemed to shimmer, as if the guests were drifting inside a cloud. Musicians played from a hidden spot. Servants glided in and out with crystal and silver that flashed like ice. Every detail was chosen to impress onlookers with a simple message. Tessie Oelrichs controls this world. She has taste, money, and power. She gets to decide who counts. Imagine being a young woman arriving at one of these events for the first time. You've spent weeks choosing your dress, your gloves, your jewelry, rehearsing how to enter the room and who to speak to first. When your carriage pulls up to Rosecliff's front door, you step out into a sea of lights and uniforms. You hear the music drifting from inside. As you walk into the house, you're very aware that you're not just a guest. You're being judged. Tessie noticed everything. Who arrived on time, who arrived late, who snubbed whom, who danced too often with the wrong person, who failed to pay proper respect to a more senior hostess. Guests knew that an entire season's reputation could rise or fall on how they performed during a few hours at Rosecliff. It was exhausting, but once you were in, it felt impossible to opt out. The whole system ran on fear. Fear of missing out, fear of being talked about, fear of being quietly dropped from the next list. Down in the kitchen, the fear was different. Servants worried about breaking something, about mixing up a course, about bringing in the wrong wine or misreading a bell. A footman who stumbled or a maid who spilled could find themselves dismissed in an instant. For them, these parties were not glamorous. They were long, hot, anxious nights that often ran into the early morning hours, followed by cleaning up and resetting the house as if nothing had happened. Yet on the terrace, under the lanterns and the stars, the illusion held. Guests laughed and flirted and gossiped, their voices drifting out over the lawns toward the dark line of the sea. A string quartet might be playing something light and cheerful. The glow from the windows turned the marble facade into something almost unreal, a palace that seemed to float above the cliffs. From a distance, it looked like happiness. Up close, the picture was more complicated. Tessie herself lived at the center of it all, but that didn't mean she was relaxed. She rarely drank, watched what others said to her, and remembered slights for years. Her identity was wrapped so tightly around her role as a hostess that a bad season could feel like a personal failure. She was not just managing parties, she was managing a brand. Mrs. Herman Oelrichs of Rosecliff, a woman whose approval or rejection could open or close doors across New York and Newport. And the more she invested in that role, the harder it became to imagine any other life. For the people outside this circle, the workers in the town, the fishermen along the coast, the immigrants passing through New York Harbor on steamships owned by men like Herman, the world inside Rosecliff might as well have been a different planet. They read about the balls in newspapers, saw sketches of gowns and decorations, and maybe felt some mix of envy and anger. Here was a house that cost millions, used for only a few weeks a year, glowing on a bluff above the ocean while factories and tenements crowded the cities. This was the Gilded Cage at the heart of Rosecliff. Tessie built it to prove that she belonged, and she succeeded. She became one of the unquestioned queens of Newport society. But every victory came with a cost: more pressure, more work, more distance between her and any simple private life she might have had. The parties made her powerful. They also trapped her. And while the music played at Rosecliff, something else was happening quietly in the background. Her marriage was fraying, the world outside was changing, and the foundations of her carefully built life were starting to crack. From the outside, the marriage of Tessie Fair and Herman Oelrichs looked solid. Steamship magnate marries Western heiress, builds a marble palace in Newport, hosts legendary parties. It reads like a successful merger, both romantic and financial. In public, Tessie played her role perfectly. The loyal wife, the gracious hostess, Mrs. Herman Oelrichs of Rosecliff. In private, things were very different. Accounts from the time make it clear that Tessie and Herman had grown deeply estranged. They lived mostly separate lives, with Tessie focused on New York and Newport society, and Herman, increasingly, wrapped up in his own business interests and health problems. She maintained the image of a devoted spouse because that image was part of her social power, but the warmth had drained out of the marriage long before the rest of the world noticed. Then the ground literally moved. On April 18, 1906, a massive earthquake hit San Francisco, the city where Tessie had once shined as a young society figure and where her father had cemented his fortune. Fires raged for days. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed. For a moment, it looked like the West Coast chapter of her life might be erased in a single disaster. Herman went west to help. As an executive tied to major shipping lines and with business interests in California, he threw himself into relief work and rebuilding efforts. Newspapers reported on his activities in San Francisco, praising his energy and public spirit. From the East Coast, Tessie followed the news with a mix of anxiety and hope. Despite their estrangement, she still saw Herman as part of her story. When word reached her that he had survived the catastrophe, she saw an opening. According to later accounts, Tessie decided this disaster could become a turning point, the kind of shock that might shake two people back together. So she did what she knew best. She planned. When Herman returned east, Tessie ordered a lavish supper to be prepared at Rosecliff. Imagine the scene. The dining room glowing with candles, silver polished to a mirror shine, crystal glasses lined up in perfect ranks, flowers arranged just so, staff waiting in their uniforms for the master of the house to arrive. This wasn't just a meal. It was a performance of reconciliation, a stage on which husband and wife might finally repair what had broken between them. He didn't show. We don't have the exact words Tessie used that night, but the record tells us she was enraged when Herman failed to appear. The humiliation would have cut deep. She had mobilized her household, signaled to the servants that something important was happening, perhaps even hinted to friends that a reconciliation was in the air. Instead, she was left alone at a glittering table, staring at an empty chair. Whatever chance there was to heal the marriage seems to have died in that moment. Herman, worn down by years of strain and by his work in earthquake-stricken San Francisco, was not a healthy man. In late summer of 1906, he sailed for Europe aboard the North German Lloyd liner Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse, hoping the trip and a change of climate might help. He never made it back. On September 4th, 1906, he died at sea, officially from Bright's disease, a chronic kidney condition, aggravated by exhaustion. The news reached Tessie by wireless. She hurried from Newport to meet the ship when it docked, greeting her husband's body at the pier. For the cameras and the society reporters, she was the grieving widow, dressed in black, surrounded by family. There is no record of what she was thinking about that missed supper at Rosecliff, or the words they never got to say to each other. But the real shock was still coming. A few days later, Herman's will was opened and filed for probate. Tessie, one of the richest women in America and the public face of his social world, was expecting the usual: a comfortable share of his estate, perhaps control of certain properties, some financial recognition of their long marriage. Instead, she got nothing. The will left the bulk of Herman's estate, valued at roughly $1 million at the time, plus specific bequests, to his brother, Charles May Oelrichs, and other relatives. Their only son, Herman Jr., received personal items like guns and jewelry and a ranch out west. Tessie, the widow who had just staged herself as the image of loyal devotion, was entirely cut out. The document stated, essentially, that she already had plenty of money of her own and didn't need a share. For a woman whose identity and power were built on social status, this was more than an insult. It was a threat. In 1906, wives, even rich ones, had far fewer legal protections than today. Many depended completely on their husbands' estates for security. Tessie had her own fortune from her father, yes, but being written out of her husband's will sent a dangerous signal that she could be sidelined, that she wasn't the true center of this powerful family. She fought back. Tessie contested the will in court, arguing that Herman was legally a resident of California at the time of his death. Under California's community property laws, she claimed, half of his estate should be hers automatically, regardless of what the will said. Legal filings flew between New York and California. For a time, it looked like there might be a drawn-out battle that would drag all the private tensions of their marriage into public view. Behind the courtroom drama was a simple question: how much was the social labor of a wife worth? For years, Tessie had hosted dinners, balls, and weekends that burnished the Oelrichs' name. She had turned Rosecliff into a symbol of their shared status. Yet when the numbers were written down on paper, the financial value of all that work was judged to be zero. Her husband assumed, or decided, that her separate fortune meant he didn't need to provide for her at all. Eventually, both sides blinked. In November 1906, a compromise was reached. Tessie agreed to drop her broader claims. In return, she received a package of securities, a substantial block of first mortgage bonds in a railway company, and their son was given a valuable ranch property in California. It was a respectable settlement on paper, but a far cry from half the estate, and it left most of Herman's remaining assets in the hands of his brother. The case ended. The damage to Tessie's sense of security did not. From this point on, Rosecliff became even more central to who she was. Her marriage was over. The man whose name was carved onto invitations in silver had effectively rejected her in his final legal act. What remained was her own fortune, her own willpower, and the house she had built to prove she belonged. She would go on hosting. She would stay a queen of Newport society for years. But behind every party at Rosecliff after 1906, there was a new, harsher truth. The woman at the center of the ballroom had learned, in the most public way possible, how fragile a high society life could be, even when you were the one who seemed to have everything. After the will fight and Herman's death, Tessie was still standing. On paper, nothing had really changed. She remained incredibly rich. She still owned Rosecliff, and her name still carried weight in Newport and New York. But something in the air around her had shifted. She had built her life around a partnership that no longer existed. The Mr. and Mrs. Oelrichs engraved on invitations was now just her, so she doubled down. In the years after 1906, Tessie kept doing what she knew how to do. She hosted. Rosecliff's ballroom still filled with music. Tables were still laid with fine china and silver. The right people still came to her dinners and dances. Outwardly, this was just the next chapter in her reign as one of Newport's great hostesses. But slowly, the world beyond those marble walls started to change. Newport's golden summer colony had always floated above the rest of America, but it couldn't stay untouched forever. The panic of 1907 rattled financial markets. New income taxes and changing political moods made showy displays of wealth a little less charming and a little more suspicious. Younger people cared less about strict calling hours and more about speed, travel, and sports. Automobiles started replacing carriages along Bellevue Avenue. The old rhythm of society, with its careful rituals and rigid rules, began to feel like it belonged to another era. Tessie didn't really bend with the times. She was the times. She kept enforcing the rules she believed in. Who could be invited together, what behavior was acceptable, how one should dress, speak, and move. To some, this made her admirable, a woman who held a standard while others let things slip. To others, especially younger guests, she seemed increasingly severe, even out of touch. The parties were still beautiful, but the fear and formality that had once made them powerful now started to feel a little heavy. As the years passed, old friends and rivals faded away. Some died. Some sold their Newport houses, unable or unwilling to keep paying for properties used only a few weeks a year. New money arrived with different habits and different tastes. Tessie remained in place, like a general who refuses to retreat even after the battle has moved somewhere else. Inside Rosecliff, the strain showed in quieter ways. Maintaining a house of that size took more effort as staff costs rose and laws slowly improved working conditions. The same social energy that had once given Tessie purpose now sometimes left her isolated. When the season ended and the guests went back to New York, Boston, or Europe, she was left wandering through echoing rooms designed for crowds. By the mid-1920s, the Gilded Age was essentially over. World War I had shaken Europe and America alike. The Jazz Age was in full swing. A new generation danced to new music in new kinds of clubs. Their idea of freedom had almost nothing to do with formal dinners under painted ceilings. In 1926, Tessie's story came to an end in the same town where she had fought so hard to become queen. She died in Newport, in the house that had been both her throne and her prison. Her funeral was held not in a grand church packed with society's finest, but in one of Rosecliff's own rooms, the blue and gold tapestry room, quieter and more intimate than the ballroom she had once filled with hundreds of guests. The woman who had lived for public approval was finally mourned in private. When the service was over and the mourners left, Rosecliff stood as it always had, white against the sky, looking out over the ocean. But the energy that had once powered it, the fierce, hungry will of Tessie fair Oelrichs, was gone. For the first time, the house had no true mistress. Others would come after her, of course, but none of them would build their entire identity around this marble stage the way Tessie had. The Queen of Rosecliff was gone, and the court she had ruled was already dissolving into memory. When Tessie fair Oelrichs died in 1926, she left behind a mansion built for an age that no longer existed. Newport itself was changing. The old Gilded Age families were scattering, some by choice, others by financial necessity. The income tax, the Great Depression, and new social values made it harder to justify maintaining palaces that stood empty most of the year. Rosecliff, with its endless rooms and staff costs, was suddenly less a trophy and more a burden. Her only son, Herman Oelrichs Jr., inherited the house, but his heart wasn't in Newport. He lived mostly in California and New York, spending his time on business, sports, and a very different kind of social scene. To him, Rosecliff was more obligation than home, a relic of his mother's obsession. He kept it for a while, opening it occasionally for small gatherings, but the great galas and cotillions were gone. By the early 1940s, he decided to let it go. In 1941, Rosecliff was sold, and with the sale came one of the saddest sights in Newport's long history of luxury, an auction of everything inside: furniture, paintings, silver, linens, chandeliers, even small household items. All of it went under the hammer. Rooms that had once glowed with candlelight and chatter were stripped bare. The echo of footsteps on marble now had nothing to soften it. Rosecliff, which had been designed as a showcase for wealth and elegance, stood hollow. For years, the house changed hands. During the mid-20th century, many Newport cottages fell into decline. Some were demolished outright. Others sat empty, their upkeep too expensive for new owners. Rosecliff was luckier. It passed through several private hands, including that of Broadway actress and singer Gertrude Nielsen, who dreamed of restoring it to its former glory, but struggled with the enormous costs. Then came a couple with both money and a touch of showmanship, J. Edgar and Louise Monroe of New Orleans. J. Edgar Monroe had made a fortune in shipbuilding, and he and his wife had a taste for Southern-style grandeur. When they bought Rosecliff in 1947, they didn't try to turn it into a museum piece. They made it their own, in color, style, and spirit. Louise Monroe filled the house with New Orleans flair, hosting themed parties and Mardi Gras balls that transformed the formal marble mansion into something warmer, livelier, even a little playful. For the first time in decades, laughter returned to the ballroom. Instead of Tessie's rigid rules, guests danced to jazz bands. Instead of white-silver formality, there were feathers, beads, and color. Newport society was long gone, but a new kind of glamour had taken its place. One less about status and more about spectacle. Still, the Monroes knew they were caretakers of something extraordinary. Louise Monroe was particularly protective of the house. She made repairs, redecorated rooms, and ensured that Rosecliff didn't fall into the kind of decay that claimed other mansions from the same era. By the 1960s, interest in Newport's Gilded Age past was returning. Tourists came to see the mansions. Historians began to write about the families who built them. And preservationists saw a chance to save what was left of a unique architectural story. In 1971, the Monroes made a decision that would secure Rosecliff's future. They donated the entire estate, the building, its contents, and a multi-million-dollar endowment to the Preservation Society of Newport County. It was one of the most generous gifts in the Society's history, and it transformed Rosecliff from a private residence into a public treasure. Visitors could now walk through the ballroom where Tessie's famous white ball had once dazzled the elite, wander the gardens that had hosted the wealthiest guests in America, and stand on the terrace where servants once carried trays of champagne to the edge of the Atlantic. But something subtle had changed. Rosecliff was no longer a home. It was a museum, a beautiful ghost. As decades passed, it became a backdrop for weddings, charity galas, and film sets. The public could finally enjoy the beauty that had once belonged to only a few. But with that transformation came a quiet question. Was this preservation or performance? Rosecliff had survived, but at a cost. The people were gone. The power was gone. Only the marble remained, cold, perfect, and waiting for the next story to unfold within its walls. By the time Rosecliff became a museum piece in the 1970s, it had already started a second life, not as a home, but as a character. If you've never been to Newport, you might still feel like you've seen Rosecliff before. That's because Hollywood has walked through its doors again and again, looking for a place that feels like wealth, romance, and danger all at once. One of the most famous examples is the 1974 film The Great Gatsby, with Robert Redford and Mia Farrow. When filmmakers needed a setting for Gatsby's world of glittering parties and hollow dreams, Rosecliff's ballroom was a natural choice. The room that once held Tessie's carefully curated guest lists now held cameras, boom mics, and actors in beaded dresses. On screen, it became Long Island in the 1920s, a perfect illusion for a story about perfect illusions. But Gatsby was far from the only time Rosecliff played dress-up. In 1956, the musical high society used Newport as its real-life backdrop, with Grace Kelly, Bing Crosby, and Frank Sinatra moving through mansions that had once belonged to the very social class the movie gently mocked. Later, films like The Betsy, Amistad, True Lies, 27 Dresses, and others would roll their cameras across Rosecliff's floors. The Sweetheart Staircase and the terrace facing the Atlantic became cinematic shorthand for old money luxury, even when the story had nothing to do with Tessie, the Fairs, or the Oelrichs at all. Each production brought lights, equipment, and crews, and more importantly, it brought something Rosecliff hadn't seen in a long time: relevance. For moviegoers, the effect is subtle but powerful. You see a couple dancing in a marble hall, or an over-the-top party spilling across a grand staircase, and somewhere in your mind you file that image under romance, wealth, elegance. You don't see Comstock miners coughing in the dark. You don't see servants collapsing into bed after a 16-hour shift. You don't see a widow sitting alone at a supper laid for two. The camera is a filter. It catches the shine and leaves the cracks. Even tours today lean into that romantic image. Guides and brochures mention the films shot here. Visitors pose on the staircase, reenacting moments from movies or using the house as a backdrop for engagement photos, wedding portraits, or just carefully curated social media posts. Rosecliff's long-ago role as a weapon in society's power games has turned into something softer, more nostalgic. A symbol of good old-fashioned glamour. But what are we really nostalgic for? When Hollywood uses Rosecliff, it rarely tells the full story of the people who built and maintained it. Instead, the mansion becomes a kind of stage mask. Behind it, a far harsher script played out. One about class, gender, and the cost of chasing status until there's nothing left but marble and memory. There's an irony here that's hard to ignore. The Great Gatsby is a story about the emptiness at the heart of wealth worship, about how beautiful parties can hide profound loneliness and moral rot. Shooting it inside Rosecliff turned a real Gilded Age status machine into the set for a warning about exactly that kind of life. Yet many viewers walk away not with the warning, but with the dream. They remember the sparkling champagne, the gowns, the music, the soaring ceilings. They say, "Wow, imagine living there." The critique turns back into aspiration. The house wins again. That's part of why, on this channel, we like to pull back the curtain. If you enjoy seeing the real stories behind grand estates, famous companies, and seemingly perfect projects, make sure you're subscribed. That way, the next time you see a place like Rosecliff on screen, you'll know what the camera isn't showing you. In the end, Hollywood didn't save Rosecliff. The Monroes and the Preservation Society did that. But the movies gave it a powerful new disguise. Today, millions of people know it only through that soft, cinematic lens. A beautiful house where beautiful people do beautiful things. The truth is more complicated and far more interesting. Because behind every smooth tracking shot through Rosecliff's ballroom is the same question that haunted Tessie's life. What did it really cost to build a world that looks this perfect? Every grand house has two sets of books. There's the one everyone sees, the public ledger. That book is full of big numbers and shiny details. How much the house cost to build, which famous architect designed it, how many guests fit in the ballroom, how many chandeliers hang from the ceiling. Rosecliff looks great in that book, but there's another ledger, a hidden one. If you could open it, you'd see different entries: hours, injuries, broken relationships, quiet fears, damaged land. Rosecliff's real story lives there. Start where the money starts, in the mines. For every dollar that flowed into the Fair family's hands from the Comstock Lode, someone went underground. A man left the surface world before dawn, rode a rattling cage deep into the earth, and worked 12 hours in heat, dust, and darkness. He swung a pick, laid charges, hauled broken rock, breathed air laced with chemicals that would destroy his lungs over time. On the surface, mills crushed ore and used mercury and other chemicals to extract silver and gold. Waste rock and toxic tailings were dumped into rivers and onto hillsides. For the Bonanza Kings, this was just production. For the people who lived downstream, it was poisoned water and ruined soil. Those miners did not get marble staircases. Many died young, from accidents, fires, cave-ins, and slow diseases. Their families were left with small payouts, if that. The Comstock made a handful of men unimaginably rich. It made far more people tired, sick, and stuck. That's one column in Rosecliff's hidden ledger. Another lies under its own roof. A mansion like Rosecliff doesn't run on its own. It runs on bodies and time. In season, the house likely had a full staff: butlers, valets, ladies' maids, housemaids, cooks, bakers, scullery maids, laundresses, gardeners, coachmen or chauffeurs, grooms, and sometimes children working as pages or errand boys. Most of them lived in cramped rooms on the upper floor or in small houses on the grounds. They were on their feet all day. A big ball at Rosecliff might have meant cooks and kitchen staff starting before dawn to prepare mountains of food. Housemaids polishing, dusting, laying fires, making beds, ironing linens, footmen and butlers rehearsing service, checking silver, aligning every glass, gardeners trimming and raking until the last leaf was out of place. Then, when the first carriage arrived, their world had to disappear. Guests saw none of this. They saw smooth service, refilled glasses, fresh flowers, and a room that somehow stayed spotless no matter how many people passed through it. Servants were there, but not really allowed to exist as full human beings. They were the help, expected to be silent, invisible, and perfectly controlled. Their names almost never appear in the official history. But without them, Rosecliff would have been just an empty shell. That's another column in the ledger. Then there's Tessie herself. It can be tempting to only see her as the powerful hostess. Cold, driven, sharp. But think about what it means to build your entire identity on social acceptance, and then have that acceptance depend on constant performance. Her childhood was unstable. A father with wealth but a bad reputation. Parents whose marriage collapsed. Years spent not really belonging to either the West or the East. Money gave her access, but it didn't erase that insecurity. So she fought for a place in the highest circle she could find. And once she got there, she had to keep proving she deserved it. Every party at Rosecliff was a test. Every season was a new exam. One misjudged snub, one failed ball, one rumor could start the long slide from essential to forgotten. On top of that came the blow of her husband's will. Imagine learning that the man whose name you carried, whose reputation you built events around, had decided, in writing, that you were owed nothing, that your role as wife, mother, and social partner had no financial value. Tessie fought back in court and won a compromise. But there's no legal settlement for that kind of emotional hit. You can't sue your way out of humiliation. You can't buy back the years you spent on a marriage that ends in a legal footnote. That's another line in the ledger. The personal cost of living for a world that can drop you the moment you stop being useful. Finally, look at the bigger picture. Rosecliff doesn't exist in a vacuum. It rose in the middle of the Gilded Age, when fortunes exploded in railroads, steel, oil, and mining. Cities filled with cramped tenements while a few families built palaces they used for a handful of weeks each year. Newspapers ran breathless coverage of their parties. Meanwhile, workers organized strikes for basic wages and safer conditions, and were often met with violence. Today, the numbers are different, but the pattern feels familiar. Billionaires build mega yachts and glass mansions. Private islands replace summer cottages. Social media plays the role of the society page. And once again, there's a temptation to stare at the photos and say, "Wow," without asking, who paid for this? Rosecliff's true cost is not just a pile of bills from the early 1900s. It's a web that stretches from Nevada mines to servant staircases, from courtroom battles to quiet funerals, from rigid ballroom etiquette to the wider world outside those gates. So the next time you see a picture of that sweetheart staircase on Instagram, or spot Rosecliff in a movie and feel that small tug of envy, it might be worth pausing. Behind the marble and the music, there's a ledger. On one side, glamour, status, beauty, fantasy. On the other, labor, risk, loneliness, damage, and the simple truth that no one builds a house like this without someone else carrying the weight. On this channel, that's what we try to do. Flip the page and look at the side most people don't read. Walk up to Rosecliff today, and, at first glance, it feels like the story has a happy ending. The lawns are trimmed. The white facade still glows against the sky. Visitors file up the front steps with paper tickets and smartphones instead of calling cards and carriage cloaks. The house is now owned and operated by the Preservation Society of Newport County, open to the public as one of several historic mansions along Bellevue Avenue. Inside, the atmosphere is quieter than in Tessie's time. Rooms are lightly furnished rather than stuffed with heavy furniture. The second floor often hosts rotating exhibitions about art, design, and culture, using the house as a backdrop for changing displays. Guests wander at their own pace, following an audio tour that tells them about Tessie's first parties, Stanford White's design, and the glamorous summers of the Gilded Age. In the ballroom, people stop, tilt their heads back, and do what they've always done here. Look up. The painted ceiling, the mirrors, the chandeliers, they're still doing their job more than a century later. Only now, instead of debutantes and dowagers, it's tourists in sneakers, couples on weekend getaways, families shepherding kids who whisper, "Whoa, it's huge." Reviews call it beautiful, elegant, and a must-see on a Newport mansion tour. The official story is smoother now. The Preservation Society's materials focus on architecture, famous owners, and the ingenuity of a house built for entertaining on a grand scale. The audio tour mentions Tessie's social ambitions and some of her more extreme parties, but it also sprinkles in charming details, like the fact that, at one point, the ballroom was used as a roller skating rink. It's a way to make history feel fun, light, and approachable. But Rosecliff today isn't just a museum, it's also a business. The mansion is one of the Preservation Society's premier rental venues. On the right night, those grand doors close to regular visitors and open for a very specific kind of client. Couples willing to spend tens of thousands of dollars to get married in front of the sweetheart staircase, or corporations booking black-tie events by the sea. The Society markets Rosecliff as an exclusive rental experience, hosting only one event per evening. The ballroom seats about 160 for dinner and dancing, with other rooms used for ceremonies and dessert. Planning guides estimate that just renting Rosecliff for a wedding, before food, flowers, or photography, runs somewhere in the range of tens of thousands of dollars. In other words, the house has returned to a familiar role, a filtering gate that only certain people can afford to pass through on their special night. The faces and fashions have changed. The price of entry has not. Beyond weddings, Rosecliff hosts flower shows, food and wine festivals, and other high-profile events that turn its terrace and gardens into photo-ready stages. Social media is full of images shot here. Brides framed by the heart-shaped staircase, influencers twirling in the ballroom, guests clinking glasses under the same painted sky that looked down on Tessie's white ball. What most visitors don't see is the ongoing debate behind the scenes. Running a historic mansion is expensive. Roofs leak, foundations shift, climate control systems struggle against salt air and time. Renting the space for high-end events helps pay for preservation. At the same time, every catered gala and wedding nudges Rosecliff a little further toward becoming what it already plays in movies, a fantasy backdrop, slightly detached from the harder truths of the people and systems that built it. None of this means you shouldn't visit. If anything, walking through Rosecliff with both ledgers in mind, the visible one and the hidden one, makes the experience more powerful. You can admire the craftsmanship and beauty while also asking quiet questions. Who cleaned these floors? Who paid for this marble? Who gets to stand here now? If you enjoy looking at places like this and asking those kinds of questions, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. We're not here to ruin the view, just to sharpen it. Because in the end, Rosecliff today is a mirror. It shows us what we choose to remember, and what we're still willing to ignore, as long as the picture looks perfect. Let's go back to that first image. A bride on the sweetheart staircase, a string quartet in the corner, glasses raised under chandeliers that have already watched 100 parties come and go. To most people in that room, Rosecliff is just a perfect backdrop, a beautiful place to start a story. But now you know it's really where a lot of stories ended. Behind the marble and the mirrors is a straight line that runs from Nevada mine shafts to the Newport cliff walk. From men sweating underground in the Comstock Lode, to James Graham Fair's rough rise as a bonanza king, to a daughter who learned early that money could open doors, but only if you spent it the right way. Tessie Fair Oelrichs took that lesson and turned it into a life plan. She married into East Coast respectability. She studied the rules of old money and then used them as weapons. She hired the most fashionable architect in America to build her a French-style palace on the Rhode Island coast. She filled it with music, carefully chosen guests, and enough glitter to blind anyone who tried to look too closely at where the fortune came from. For a while, it worked. Rosecliff made her powerful. It helped her push past the sneers at mining money, helped her sit at the very top of the social pyramid she'd once only read about in newspapers. But the same house that lifted her up also made the fall harder. Her marriage cracked behind closed doors. The husband whose name she used to command respect signed a will that left her nothing. She fought in court and won a compromise, but she couldn't litigate away the fact that, in his final word, he didn't think he owed her a cent. She kept the parties going, but the world moved on, toward wars, taxes, jazz, and new kinds of freedom that didn't care much about calling cards and correct visiting hours. In the end, Tessie died in the town she had worked so hard to rule, mourned in a quiet room of the house that was supposed to guarantee she'd never be forgotten. Rosecliff outlived her. It outlived her son's interest, the auctioneers who stripped its rooms, the mid-century buyers who tried different versions of the dream. It survived long enough to be rescued, repainted, and repackaged as a wedding venue, a film set, a museum piece, a fantasy you can rent by the evening or tour with headphones on. So what is the real, dark story of Rosecliff? It isn't just that it was built on dangerous money, or that its mistress died more lonely than her invitation suggested. It's that we still struggle with the same equation today. We love the dream and try not to look too closely at the bill. Grand houses, mega yachts, private islands, massive tech campuses, they all have two ledgers. One shows up in glossy photos and press releases. The other is written in tired workers, stressed families, altered landscapes, and the quiet ache of people who bet their lives on status and found out it doesn't love them back. Rosecliff just makes that equation easier to see because the house stayed standing while the people fell away. If you've watched this far, you're probably like us, interested in what's behind the curtain, not just what's on stage. So if you enjoy deep investigations into mansions, fortunes, and the hidden costs of high society, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which house, family, or mega project you want to see next. Because for every beautiful place we admire, there's always another page in the ledger, and sooner or later someone has to read it.